Today, we are going to the mid-20th century, so sit back as we go to Australia. Jean Lee was born on the 10th of December 1919 in the small Australian city of Dubbo in the state of New South Wales. Her parents named her Margaret Jean Maud Wright, and she was the youngest of 5 children. Her father, Charles Wright, worked on the railways, where he was in charge of a gang of labourers, and her mother, Florence, spent most of her time bringing up the children. In 1927, when Jean was 8 years old, the family moved from the more rural life in Dubbo and went to live 390 kilometres away in the busy and rapidly growing city of Sydney. The family settled in Chatswood on Sydney's North Shore, and Jean attended the local Roman Catholic school. She was known to be a friendly and quite studious child, and her parents provided her with a comfortable upbringing. She was occasionally a bit rebellious, but she paid enough attention in class to pass all of her school exams. When she was 16 years old, she decided to leave education and enter the workplace. She did, however, find it difficult to stay in employment at any one place for very long, and seemed to drift from one job to the next. She worked as a milliner, a waitress, and as a general worker in a canned food factory, but nothing really inspired her, and she always ended up leaving or getting fired. When she was 18 years old, she married a 25-year-old painter and decorator named Raymond Thomas Breeze, and in April 1839 she gave birth to their daughter. Their marriage was always strained, and although Jean had never had much money as a child, she found life as a married woman and a mother particularly difficult. Her husband was often out of work and would regularly spend what little money they had in the pub. It was not the life that Jean had imagined for her or her child, and with no real hope of any improvement for her very poor financial situation, Jean took her daughter and left her husband. Life as a single mother, however, was far from easy, and Jean also found herself strained by financial hardship. So in order to try to better her prospects, she entrusted her daughter to her mother and tried to move forward with her life. But Jean struggled to improve her fortunes and always seemed to get involved with the wrong type of people. Her life consisted mainly of petty crime and prostitution. She spent most of her time in Sydney and Brisbane and used many different aliases, but the one she felt most comfortable with was the name Jean Lee. In 1943, she began an association with a man named Maurice Diaz. He was a petty criminal and known to the police. He started to manage her earnings from prostitution, and her income supported them both. Fed up with supporting Maurice, Jean left him, but not for a law-abiding working man. Instead, she fell in love with another professional criminal named Robert David Clayton. How had life gone so wrong for her? Between May 1945 and July 1948, she appeared 23 times at Sydney's Central Police Court, with the majority of the charges relating to offensive behaviour. She was the daughter of hard-working parents and grew up in a comfortable environment, but now she often found herself on the wrong side of the law. In 1949, she was finally divorced from her husband, Raymond Thomas Breeze, and in October the same year, her boyfriend Robert Clayton was released from a short spell in prison. Robert considered Jean to be an asset for his criminal activities. She was 30 years old, intelligent and attractive, and he liked to include her in his crimes. Shortly after his release from prison, Jean and Robert travelled to Melbourne, where they met up with another criminal named Norman Andrews. Norman and Robert had met in prison, and both men were considered to be career criminals. The trio continued their criminal ways, and they became well known to the Victoria State Police. The main criminal activity that they engaged themselves in was a very simple enterprise known in the trade as the badger game. Jean would sit alone in a bar or a hotel and wait to be approached by a man. She would talk and flirt with him and eventually suggest that they go to a hotel room. Once they were there, Robert Clayton would appear and make out that he was Jean's husband and inform the unfortunate victim that if he didn't hand over some money, they would inform his wife about what he had been doing, or if he wasn't married, they would inform work colleagues and family. As the majority of their victims were respectable married men who were anxious to avoid any embarrassing conversations with their wives, they usually quickly paid up. For those who didn't, Robert Clayton would introduce them to his friend, Norman Andrews, and if he could not persuade them to pay, he would rob them anyway. They also were involved in other petty crime, but nothing that could be considered a major robbery. Then, a man named William Pop Kent came to their attention. He was a 73-year-old gentleman who lived alone and owned a few properties that he rented out. It was also rumoured that he operated as an off-track bookmaker, and as this type of operation was illegal at the time, Clayton and Andrews figured that he must hide his money at his home. They decided that he would be a perfect target for their operation. He was elderly, and as he operated in an illegal market, he would not be able to report them to the police once they had robbed him, so they considered him a pretty easy target. On the evening of November the 7th, 1949, Jean Lee, Robert Clayton and Norman Andrews saw William Kent in a Melbourne hotel lounge. Not wanting to miss the opportunity, Jean went and sat with him, and the two of them shared a few drinks and some pleasant conversation. Eventually she suggested that they go back to his apartment. The plan seemed to be going exactly as they had hoped, and as they travelled back to the apartment, Andrews and Clayton followed. Not long after Jean had arrived at the apartment, Andrews and Clayton entered. This time they were not demanding hush money. They just wanted to rob William Kent of all the illegal money they were convinced that he had accumulated and had hidden at his property. They tied his hands behind his back and tied his thumbs together, and then tied him to a chair. But he kept on telling them that he didn't have any money at the property. The trio, however, didn't believe him, and the elderly gentleman was punched, kicked, and cut with a small knife to try and get him to reveal where all the money was hidden. But William continued to insist that apart from a small roll of notes, there was no money in the apartment. Neighbours heard all the commotion and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the trio had gone. When the police entered the apartment, they realised that it had been robbed. There was broken furniture, open drawers with the contents all over the floor, and the whole place looked pretty ransacked. Then, when they removed a pile of sheets, they found the body of William Kent, and it looked like he had been strangled. The police soon identified the victim, and it didn't take long for them to track down Jean Lee, Robert Clayton and Norman Andrews at a local hotel. They were all well known to the police, and the police were also aware of their badger game. At the hotel, the police found blood-stained clothing in the trio's rooms. They soon arrested them and took them back to the police station. There they were all questioned separately, and all three denied any involvement in the crime. But as the questioning continued, and the police started to introduce more and more evidence, each suspect started to pass the blame on the other two. The police would then take one statement and use it to try and extract confessions from the other two. When the authorities decided that they had enough evidence, they charged all three suspects with murder. Their trial started on March the 20th, 1950, at Melbourne's Criminal Court. As the three defendants had all tried to blame the other two, the the judge outlined to the jury the law of common purpose. He explained that if 3 people take part in a violent robbery or murder, they are all equally guilty, irrespective of who strikes the fatal blow. Jean was very distressed at being tried for murder and continued to plead her innocence. She maintained that she was an onlooker and was not an active participant in the crime. The trial lasted for 6 days, and it took the jury just 3 hours to find all 3 defendants guilty, and they were sentenced to death. Following the verdict, Jean became hysterical, whilst her boyfriend Robert Clayton shouted abuse at the jury. Their lawyers immediately appealed the verdict. At the appeal hearing, the defence claimed that the trio's statements to the police had been obtained improperly, as they were all used to extract confessions from each other. And on the 23rd of June, 1950, the Court of Criminal Appeal ruled that the way the police had obtained the confessions was indeed unlawful and granted a retrial. This was a great relief for Jean and her 2 accomplices, but any joy they felt from having the verdict overturned and a retrial granted was short-lived, as the prosecution went back to court and demanded that the appeal decision be overruled and the original convictions and sentences be reinstated. After consideration, the High Court agreed and overturned the appeal decision and reinstated the original sentences. Jean Lee, Robert Clayton and Norman Andrews would hang for their crime. The case had been headline news throughout Australia, and some public sympathy emerged for Jean, especially in Melbourne, where no woman had been hanged in the state of Victoria for 56 years. While in prison, Jean suffered violent mood swings and tried to attack her guards. She would often say to them, "I just didn't do it. I haven't enough strength to do it. Bobby was stupid, but the old man was trying to yell for help. None of us meant to kill him." Telegrams of protest were sent to the government, but the decision was not going to be overturned, and at 8 a.m. on the 19th of February 1951, while protesters waited outside the Pendridge prison, Jean Lee became the last woman to be hanged in Australia. 2 hours later, Robert Clayton and Norman Andrews met the same fate. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case.